Heavenly Father, we thank you for this technology that links us all together. Mimicking perhaps the way you communicate and respond to us. We thank you for these teachers that we have, for the work that Marty puts in to this. We thank you for what we get to read and the freedom that we enjoy. We ask that your Spirit would be with us today as we consider these things. And we thank you in Jesus' name, and we pray in his name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Paul. Well, here we are in the 7th. We've passed the peak, and we're heading down the far side of the mountain of 12. So book 7, probably the most readable of the ones that I've read so far. Bill, did you get a copy of this somewhere?
The book? Yeah. Ohio State University.
Right. My copy originally came from the Andover Newton Theological School. So I purchased it, but libraries apparently pass these things on. So that's where mine came from. So, and have you found it kind of readable, kind of enjoyable?
Well, the first thing I did was went to the names index and found Torrance cited only second to Einstein. Torrance was cited 8 times, and then Bart about 6, and Maxwell about 5 or 6. And anyway, I did make note of the well, you can't see it, but the Torrance quotes are references.
Yeah. Good. And did everyone find the handout that I posted on the reading group site?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah. Just don't want to have you miss it and say, if only I'd known, I would have got it. So, so again, Science and the Gospel, we're dealing with a book that lives within a broader exploration of theology and science at the frontiers of knowledge. So again, this was written in 1987. So that's a bit of a frontier ago. It's not quite the wild, wild west, but it's the world of science and the world of theology have both moved a bit. And yet I do find it, compelling for the conversation that helps us understand Torrance, as well as generally the subject themes of theology and science moving forward. So my nutshell statement there, this book argues for a proper understanding of science, opening humans to the reality given in Jesus. So he was a pastor, a minister in Canada, and Torrance himself says that the nature of this work is a result of his years of preaching the gospel and also being somebody highly attuned to and reading in scientific context. So science in this book, properly conceived, should lead us to the gospel, in a sense explains the title, Science and the Gospel. And I think to go with Torrance, even in his conversation with Princeton as to how he would teach when they said, well, you can't evangelize here. And he says, well, actually, I take a scientific approach to teaching theology. This book would represent at some level what was meant by Torrance's sense that for him, theology was to proceed with a scientific endeavor. This is the only book I found. I didn't get from Carey. He's been buried. The book reviews sometimes he finds for me. So this is the only book I'm aware of. Did you look, Bill, for other things that he might have written? Did you find anything else?
I didn't. As a matter of fact, I was going to look him up. I did not. Something came up. I forget what it was.
It's called Life.
Sorry?
It's called Life. Life came up, and
oh, yeah.
And there are other things to do then, but that's okay. So, yeah, I think the nature of being a preacher gave him a clarity of discussion that I find not as available in all of the other writers. So, and I did 2 chapters because he wrote with very short chapters. I mean, there wasn't a chapter that was longer than like 8 pages in the whole book. So it's like, wow, maybe 9. Somebody who writes short, punchy chapters. This is somebody who knows how to write a sermon to get an idea across. And to not bury the reader in all that. So, and I hope you all found those 2 pages and the foreword that I posted last Saturday or Sunday, whenever it was, as well. Did anybody else get the book? I know Bill has a way of going out of his way to find the book. Yeah. Good. Well, that's why I put up some chapters, so at least you get a sample and are able
Just
to read.
for information, maybe Paul, Ted probably knows this, but you can find most of these books on archive.org online. You can borrow it
Thank you.
for either an hour or 14 days, whatever they offer.
Yes.
And do they charge for that, or is that free?
No, it's free. There's no
Okay.
charge. And
Yeah.
I'm
I
amazed.
went and took a look at it.
Archive.org.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll check that out. I wasn't aware of that.
This
Really
book is
cool.
in there.
Feel free whenever you see me posting something. If you see that they have it, you can add a link to that site for that book so that people know that it's available in a more extended.
I did.
Okay, I didn't see that. So, but that's, thank you.
There you go.
Build a backup team. That's good. So I'm just gonna read the part in the general foreword that Torrance puts out there. That specifically, he has a general foreword, but he always adds. In this case, it's one big paragraph and one very short paragraph to it. So I'm going to read that. Science in the gospel comes from, this is on page Roman numeral 9, starting at the top of the page. Science and the gospel comes from the pen of one who has had a long and distinguished ministry in the United Church of Canada for most of the time in Montreal. Throughout this ministry, Dr. Fiddes has brought to it a profound interest in the arts and sciences, in the belief that truth, properly grasped and appreciated, is everywhere found to be harmoniously linked in the universe that God has created and given to us as our home. This conviction bore fruit in earlier years in the publication of a book on architecture, in which he sought to interrelate the arts and Christian worship. I didn't find that book, by the way. That would be interesting. The present work emerged, as he tells us, from the necessity of preaching under an ever-growing conviction that the gospel must be proclaimed and interpreted within the context of our scientific understanding of the created universe. So he's seeing science, in a sense, as a handmaiden, so to speak, for the work of the preaching of the gospel. The difficulty which he kept on meeting, however, and which made the preaching of the gospel an almost impossible task, was the wide gap that had opened up in people's minds between the essence of the Christian faith in Christ and the scientific culture it had inspired. Hence, in his regular preaching and teaching of the gospel, Dr. Fiddes showed that it is a serious mistake to assume that a properly scientific understanding of nature requires a repudiation of the biblical understanding of the world and a rejection of Christ as himself the way, the truth, and the life. At the same time, he set himself to work out for his congregation a deeper consideration of the relationship of natural science and Christian belief, in which the deep wound in the prevailing outlook might be healed, which I love it when scientists and theologians work for that healing task. He found that, as a matter of fact, a paradigmatic shift has been taking place in the conceptual structure of modern science, in which the self-sufficiency of science itself is seriously challenged, and the need for a deep level integration between science and faith is found to be necessary if the new dimensions of reality being brought to light through scientific discovery are to be adequately grasped and relevantly integrated in our human life. Science in the gospel is the fruit of that lifelong ministry. It is written in a modest and yet challenging way, which will undoubtedly be helpful to many people today and years to come, of course, us sitting here today. We're very grateful to the Reverend Robert T. Walker of Edinburgh for generous help with the proofs. And of course, Robert Walker also is the editor for Atonement and Incarnation that were published by InterVarsity, which was the course that T.F. Torrance taught at Edinburgh. So his nephew, I believe, is that right?
Okay.
Yeah. So generous for his help with the proof. So he's been a help the TF in the task of writing for many decades. So before we jump into the outline, is there anything that you read or found particularly of interest? Anything that you want to particularly, threads that you want to pursue as we go through this? So you may have things that were insights or things that were questions, anything that you want to bring at this point, I'd be happy to hear.
Well, when we reach chapter 2, I noticed what I came across is not in your outline, so I'd like to, on page 19,
Okay.
Type in at that time. So.
Yeah. Typing in is fine, yeah. It's tricky to know when you're attempting to summarize, it's tricky to know, how to get the essence of what's going on. So I simply try and give, a simple, there are phrases that jump out at me. And so I'm glad that you jump in with.
Not sure this is of the essence, but it's interesting.
Well, that's the value of having other people to jump in, because if it's interesting to you, then we want to talk about it. So
yeah,
I select things that are interesting for me. It's actually one of the points that Polanyi makes, is that scientists choose to study what's interesting to them. And so to say the nature of scientific work in and of itself is a selective process, which means you're also deselecting a lot of things. So the basic argument of the book that science has deselected to study theology is one of the pitfalls of a scientific approach that becomes so focused that it loses the context. And so the book is really trying to reassert the context of the creator God of the world and the nature of that God in relation to it as a necessary context to understand within it all. So if that makes sense.
Yep.
You can jump out with the things that are of interest to you. Did anyone else have any interesting thoughts or questions or anything about this book before we proceed along? Hello, Linda. It's good to see you show up there. Okay. Well, we'll just. What's that?
Sorry, my phone.
Okay. Okay. So back to the ivory tower, which again, the ivory tower, the question of who controls the ivory tower at some level might be the question here. He talks about, dialogues where there are people talking about faith, science, and human understanding, which one would want, in a sense, faith, science, and human understanding. And it's always interesting which word goes first. Faith, then science, then human understanding, and often an attempt to bring them together as though they're not already together, which is one of the points that he'll make with this book, that maybe if you separate them out, you've already taken a misstep. But his concern in just beginning this book is that often the discussions that form the topic of what this book unfolds as often collapse into people simply wanting to use faith and science to address political and economic issues. If we're Christians, we should be caring for this. We should be politically involved. We should be involved in issues that are of concern for the everyday person, and they tend not to particularly be theological things. So the concern for who gets to manage the conversation about the relation between faith and science is a very important question. I have sat with professors of science who've said, when I tell them I'm a theologian, they say, hasn't all that theology stuff been done away with? God of the gaps is no longer necessary. What is there left to talk about, kind of? And the assumptions of that basically science tells the truth. They are the priests of the modern world, the priests of the ancient world. The church are no longer necessary. So anyway, that kind of undergirds, I think, much of this whole book. My dad, before he died, actually asked me the question, why do people still go to church? I don't understand it. He taught science, high school science, and for me, it was a driving concern to try and answer his question. So I have a particular vested interest in still living within the conversation that my dad kind of brought to the table. Why do people still go to church? Why do they discuss theology?
They don't necessarily discuss theology in church.
That is
I get what he's saying. Never mind.
Point too, yeah. Well, we might say they don't discuss good theology in church. I mean, there's an attempt. If you're asked, do you talk about God here? They'd say, well, of course.
Yeah.
And then the question of, what do you say about God? Well, we tell people how God will make their life better, or how they need to be more obedient and all that. And it becomes a very human focused endeavor.
I
And so
would
that
call
is
I would call it retail theology.
retail theology. That's a
Yeah.
good word.
That's what I would call it.
Right.
There's the thought.
Yeah. There's I taught a class on Colossians and postmodern theology, and in there I talked about different forms of postmodernism, and some of them are philosophical. We need to be done with modernism that attempts to manage the modern world. But one of them I talked about was a marketing form of postmodernism, that it's all that is new and wants to be done with the old so we can bring in the new. And I think that's very, very close, Paul, to what it is that you're saying here. So maybe a greater challenge than ever as the world has become so marketing dominated. The challenge is there is something about the euangelion, the good news of the gospel, it does intend to speak and invite people into a consideration of something that they otherwise wouldn't. So how to distinguish what it is that we do in bringing the gospel to people, and how it doesn't become mere marketing, but becomes meaningful conversation. I mean, that is one of the challenges I think we have to deal with. And the point B I have on there, pragmatism in Christian leadership. J.B. Torrance, I remember, would say, churches today all want to talk about how do you do church? How do you get people to church? How do you build programs? And he says that's always going to be the wrong question. Who is always the question. Who is it that we are focusing on? Who is it that will speak to us? Who will speak even through the preacher? Who will be represented in the nature of what it is that we show up as a body of people? Are we just representing ourselves in this culture, or are we really letting who Jesus is be known? So there was a clarity in J.B. Torrance's mind is just what word we use and beginning to ask what it means to be the church and how we function out of that. So I think he argues then that the dethroning of theology as the queen of sciences was largely done in the church and not by science. And that's because of this concern for how do we make our church some form of the word successful. And that in doing that, they lost the value of what it is to have theology as the ground of truth for how we interpret and understand who God is, the world that God creates, our participation in it, and what it means to be a witnessing people who live the gospel and bring that in a tangible kind of way to the people who live in the neighborhoods around us. Which is an interesting thought, that the church is what dethroned theology as the queen of the sciences.
I don't think that happens in every church.
Probably not in every church.
And I remember I was on a pastor search committee, and I'm the least accomplished theologically of anyone here, but I've had a lot of experience with churches.
Yeah.
I was on the pastor search committee, and there was some sort of marketing thing that was floating around. And so we asked him, it was a telephone interview. Was not successful for us, but it was successful for him because I think he decided to avoid it. Well, we asked him if he was familiar with this marketing technique. We didn't call it that, but it had a name for it. I can't remember what it was. It was 30 years ago. And we live in a little suburb of Miami called Miami Springs. And so we asked him if he was ready to install something like that in our church. And he said, well, I think I'd prefer to be there for a while and find out what God is doing in Miami Springs. That brought us all up short. And that's sort of basic theology, that he's there already, and we want to get ourselves in line with what he's doing if we can discover it. But anyway.
Oh, that's good. I mean, I think that there is an attentiveness that's there. It's difficult to evaluate whole denominations, but to say the major denominations have gotten caught up in a lot of bureaucracy, it seems, and are battling on many fronts and largely diminishing. I don't know. The GCI, I think, has a focus on theology that excels beyond all others, and it's probably its biggest challenge is an aging population. Would that be true, Ted?
Yes, I call it the demographic cliff.
The demographic cliff. Okay.
Of which I'm the leading edge.
Well, not quite, Ted.
Maybe not quite.
There's some ahead of you.
That's true. There's a few people who are still outliving me.
That's right.
So to say, I mean, the question of the demographic cliff. I've had some conversations with Michael, the new president there, and just kind of looking at the trajectory of where is GCI going, particularly the seminary, and to say if you go with words like Trinitarian and all that as your quote unquote marketing terms, it's very likely a younger generation will not know what you're talking about and say this is not for me. And so I suggested you might use terms like relational facilitation within the life of God, or learning to develop life informed by a God-directed way of being. I mean, something that that informs participation, listening to God, being transformed through relationship. That there might be terms that a younger generation, and in a sense, this is a marketing question, right? What terms will connect with people where what you're saying isn't going to change content-wise, but you're just allowing it to be in a language that's not Japanese to people.
Good point.
So anyway, that's the question, and I think you're right, Paul, that there are certainly churches that do have it right. I haven't done the research, but I'd say most churches today are struggling to survive, and marketing questions are high on their agenda. But not all of them. And so we want to learn from the ones that are otherwise, and find helpful ways to encourage those who maybe have gotten into that trap to rediscover the value of vital theology for a church that can really engage a younger generation to say, oh, they're not out of touch with the world as it exists, but in fact are leading thinking about that, living at the frontier. So anyway, I think they're important issues. They were then 40 years ago, and they are today as well. So knowledge of truth through the human intellect is his assessment that became part of the problem. This is a 19th century problem that when the 20th century, Karl Barth and T.F. Torrance were probably those who stood against it mostly. But to say, it's amazing how many people, even pastors, I mention Karl Barth or T.F. Torrance and they've never heard of him. I'll say, well, T.F. Torrance was the greatest English-speaking theologian of the 20th century, and Karl Barth was probably the greatest theologian since Thomas Aquinas. John Calvin, falls in there too, but he was an interpreter of Calvin. So, and they haven't heard of him. So, I mean, they're certainly not going to be under the influence of, getting a clear picture of what they were doing and trying to revitalize the church as being astute and really trying to help the church to find its way in the era that we find ourselves in. So if the knowledge of the truth comes through the human intellect as its starting point, then for both of them, it will ultimately collapse into something that simply serves the human and not God. And so for Karl Barth, the language of natural theology was the avoiding of starting with the human intellect. And for T.F. Torrance, he tried to be friends with the term natural theology and new natural theology, which is more of a theology of nature. But his avoidance of mythology, of dualism, all of those things were attempts to avoid the human pitfall of trying to start with human perceptions of the world out there and the thought world inside, and separating them out, which breaks everything down, basically. So this idea of objectivity through human methodology, that science deals with the objective world and that humans have the methods of discovering the truth, and people want the truth. So science, that's where we're going to go. Has science proved this? Is kind of the creedal statement of the modern world. which branch of science are you speaking of? And, who are the people who are in power there? Do they have other agendas? So that the new atheists are generally scientists, but they have an agenda that's an atheistic agenda. That brings in problematic starting points for conversations with theology. Dawkins, Carrie Magruder actually had I think an onstage conversation with Dawkins once, and Carrie said he just wouldn't let him get a word in edgewise. And Carrie's quite brilliant, but he's also humble and doesn't force his way in. And so, for me, that was a little bit of a metaphor of an overzealous scientific approach that wants to put down theology and won't even let the theologically minded, brilliant person speak. It's just the tragedy of the loss of conversation that I think we need, that I think this book is inviting. So the plea for planning and research, the nature of what it is that it would look like for church and science to work together, to be committed to being those who look to the future, who research what is and what could be, and to recognize, and here he quotes TFT, this is one of his first quotations, that natural science cries out for a proper doctrine of creation. So rather than to say that natural science should abandon it, which is what most scientists think, Torrance is going to say that the natural sciences themselves cry for a proper context for a doctrine of creation. Does anybody have any idea why he says that?
Well, I can read the context of the paragraph.
Go for it.
Give you a break. The unease to which I refer is the growing recognition on the part of people who are closest to the theoretical science that things in the material realm are not what they appear to be, that man does not really have answers, and apart from the illumination of faith, is not likely to get them. I'm aware that this may not be the impression gained from looking at science TV or reading current popular science. The general impression is that natural science is now on the verge of solving the riddle of the universe, and that if it is just given a little more time and a lot more money, this goal will be attained. More realistic, it seems to me, is the conclusion of Professor T.F. Torrance. Natural science, through its remarkable intelligibility, cries out for a proper doctrine of creation. And he calls that a Macedonian call.
Going back to the biblical image of come over to Macedonia and help us.
Right.
But the Spirit, there is this call. So, which is a beautiful image that is there. So, to say the Macedonian call is we have a world of scientists who have kind of lost the meaning of it all, and they think the answers are simply in being able to measure, judge, define, categorize, classify everything, and that'll give us the answers to everything. And I think Torrance is saying, but you've lost all the meaningfulness of it all, and really the proper context for it all, and therefore it ends up being somewhat meaningless.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if I may, just this one short couple of sentences, it seems to me that when a Macedonian call like this is heard, the leadership of the church should not be so engaged with the material problems of the world that it cannot respond. It should have some of its most powerful reserves in the ivory tower. It should have some of its most powerful reserves in the ivory tower.
I think that represents what the academy would be doing if it was really serving the church. So T.F. Torrance represents the thinkers who are bringing together the conversation.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But the ivory tower in theology has been fairly empty because you've had a lot of people who do exactly what scientists are doing. They just make it all about humans and the natural world without God. So T.F. Torrance, Karl Barth would represent a rare jewel in the ivory tower, and we need more of that.
Yeah, one might say that there's an ivory tower on both sides.
And they're throwing rocks at each other.
Yeah, and both lacking humility. But that's as Fiddes points out there's a growing sense of humility, at least among some scientists, that things are not the way they look.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a remarkable thing, and it would be good, I think, if there was a sort of a concomitant humility on the other side among theologians. And I see that. Well, I see that in Torrance. I mean, by him sort of having a kind of a rough exterior, which he's rather demanding at times, but I think his willingness to question, to look in a fresh way at the evidence is admirable, and I think he finds sort of a sympathetic audience among some scientists, not all of them, to be sure.
Yeah.
Especially the ones that are sort of more on the leading edge, where like this universe is not what it looks like. You know?
Well,
Right.
I would suggest that
Yeah.
that 40 years later, science itself has fallen or is falling into disrepute, tainted with corruption and power plays, politically charged. I think there's an opening here, for re-examination of the idea that science is somehow ascendant. So even though the cliff is approaching, I think that there's also, I think science is wounded.
And wounded means it needs some doctoring. And I mean, I think the role of the church in that, we're not just about abstract ideas about God. The God who comes in the person of Jesus Christ does come to bring reconciliation and redemption. And for us to recognize that even the disciplines of science, I mean, Luke was a doctor who understood that the healing of human bodies and all of that was part of what it meant to be stewards within God's creation, and that God was the one who does it ultimately, but we do serve in the ways that we function. That would speak to the exact thing that you're saying, that we have a called alongside place to be those who bring clarity and hope as to the service of what theology brings, but also a better vision of what science could bring to the world as well, as what Torrance would call priests of creation. Scientists are priests of creation. They come to know and care for and mediate, in a sense, for creation. So I think what you're saying is good. And the question of, what would it look like? I mean, it's the thought of doing a TF Torrance on theology and science, healing the division or healing the something, could be an interesting kind of thing to attempt to formulate. So anyway, we'll think about that. Dwayne, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, I'm just getting good at doing this, but it slows the process down and is blurting out the idea and spontaneously. But actually, I was doing some research, biblical theology. That word guard and keep in guard in the Hebrew, it doesn't just mean work, it means worship. And part of the problem, it goes back to what Athanasius talks about, and Tom and Carl understood this. It's one thing to know God as creator, but it's a whole other thing to understand him as savior, because even as creation, if you don't understand the fact that this creation is set for the fire and there's a new one expectation, this whole eschatological and meaning storyline doesn't really begin to really penetrate us, and how sin actually wreaks havoc in ways beyond our own doing, unless you know God as savior, it really. And that's the difference between the Christian scientist versus just a regular scientist. Even if they're, they have humility, there's lots of blind spots you have, and you can't see the meaning or the purpose, or because a lot of times people ask the question, well, why did God allow this? And what God are we talking about? What do you mean allow? There's a lot of blind spots there. So it's sort of a Swiss cheese kind of thing. You can get parts of it, but there's still things that they will never understand unless they come to faith.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, the body of Christ has many people. We have holes within it, and that's where there are many parts of the body with people with different giftings to help together come and ask the question of how do we become those who are part of the healing again, the nature of salvation, there is a reconciliation with God, but also there is this healing up broken hearts and broken lives that are part of what that is too. Jesus' first sermon there in Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and all that he does out of that engages in the healing of the world with God and with humanity as well. So that is the Jubilee restoration sense, and restoration is a significant kind of thing. Thanks, Dwayne, for that. So the history of notable blunders in the church. He just talks about what developed as the resistance of modern science to the church, and I think the church to modern science, where we still don't have as many as I would like. There are people who have been notable Christians who have been involved in medicine and so forth. The Genome Project. What's his name?
Francis Collins.
Francis Collins would be a notable person who's overtly a Christian in the modern world of science, and I think has earned respect there. But I think we need scientists who are Christians who speak up. I was sad that Tim Keller died. I think he's somebody who is in the Christian world who had a respect for science that I think was a bridge builder as well. The idea of a reasonable faith, and somebody who is certainly a man of faith himself. These human embodiments that bridge the gap allow people on both sides of the conversation to see persons who are, as Ted said, humble in coming to the conversation. They're not dominating or making people feel that they shouldn't be in the conversation, but really creates a space for a broader conversation. So yeah, John Lennox, I have seen John Lennox in person, Tim. He was at Regent at one point. I heard him speak there. He is also an Oxford mathematician. And he is, I think, also helpful. I don't know. Has anybody else heard of John Lennox? See, there's the problem. I mean, he's we have Oxford mathematicians who speak, articulately the gospel, and we don't know about him. So, Tim, you know him because you're over there in the great isles of the Far East there. But
yeah, Marty, just to
Yeah.
say, what I found very interesting about John Lennox was that he was contemporary at Cambridge with C.S. Lewis.
Right.
Who he often mentions the process by which C.S. Lewis would don his garb and start his lecture walking up and down. So if nothing, it's really worth listening to that sort of stuff. I found it very good anyway.
Yeah. Is there a recording somewhere that you heard of that, or? Was there a recording?
Yes, it's on one of the YouTube ones, but I think he repeats the episode many times. But it wouldn't be difficult to find.
Very good. Okay, good. So there are a few individuals out there who embody something that is pointing towards what it is that I think Fiddes is looking for here. But to say most people in most churches, the question of science and theology are not conversations that are being had very much. So it seems like it's a frontier. I mean, again, the theology and science and the frontiers of knowledge. The church itself is a frontier to be engaged, to help people to be conversant about, what is science? What is the nature of the interrelationship of engaging the world that God has created, and how we become those who think intelligently about it and find the meaningfulness and purposefulness that theology brings to that conversation. And he talks about the willful conservatism and pseudoscience, bad readings of the Bible. And again, I think that probably he's talking about some of the creation scientists that they debate in some kind of ways, but I think that Torrance, was frustrated with those people as well. They end up saying something that is not respected because it's it's based on a simple reading of the Bible that's not in any way acknowledging the nature of what the natural sciences are doing. And so becomes somewhat embarrassing, I think. Dwayne, I see your head up again there.
Actually, one of the problems we have, I'm going back to, I think it was, your friend that lives just around the corner here in your Seattle area. That he commented how we're the problem is we're bilocational. We're the people in the body of Christ as whole, and we're also a specific location, and that's the problem with knowledge. You know, this group knows each other, and we're scattered all over the place, but who are these people? Like even someone like Einstein or like Tom or any of these people that are brilliant, no person can ever reach the whole world if they're not God at the same time. So no one can actually. There might be. It's like those history of ideas where you got contemporaneous people in different parts of the world working on the same thing, and then whoever records the first, quote unquote, gets credit, but such and such knew more or just as much. Or, and that's part of the problem, where the way God made the world in this way, that and that's where the logos comes in, and that's where that whole idea where John McKenna and different theologians, where the word, the memra, this one whom all things are made by, for, and through him, and that he is the one who is both lead the worship as well as the scientific inquiry, because he knows by and for how all things are made, and that's part of the problem, is that even in science, in theology, if you don't have the proper mediation, you can invent whatever kind of things you want, but it isn't going to be true.
Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, the whole nature of theology, the logo in theology, I mean, Christ is the word who speaks, and he is the one, as you say, in and through whom all things are created. So to understand who he is as the creator is significant in understanding the nature of the creation, which, I mean, that's the whole theme of Karl Barth's Dogmatics, Volume 3. All 4 volumes of that are basically unpacking that whole question. So, also in the modern world, we have specialization. Specialization means scientists, they know their area, but they don't know even the rest of science within the physical sciences, much less the theological sciences, or to see what the interface would look like there. So there is a sense that there is a loss of the whole, which again, TF was constantly talking about the need for understanding things in light of the whole, and his complaint against personalism and basically the social sciences is that they took a part of the created order and built off of human perceptions of it. So if you take a part out and then build with your perception, then you've got a double misstep in really doing anything that should properly be called science. And it falls more into the area of what JV pointed out Athanasius called mythology, or my-theology. If you just put the hyphen in there, mythology becomes my theology. So that is what needs to be resisted in specialization, which is selecting out in such a way that you miss the whole, and it in some ways makes untrue that focused thing that you're saying, because it's not in context. Go ahead there.
Well, within that context, this quote by Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Yes.
He quotes Solzhenitsyn as saying, quote, "The increasingly narrow specialization of professional disciplines, which enables semi-ignoramuses to become doctors of science." Solzhenitsyn speaks of semi-ignoramuses becoming doctors of science, increasing specialization. But the author goes on to say, fortunately, there are scholars who are knowledgeable in both science and theology. And he lists T.F. Torrance.
T.F. Torrance, one of them, yeah.
And goes on to mention that he was awarded the Templeton.
Yeah.
So he calls him a man. Even though there are few with vision, he says there are those such as Torrance.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, we have a model of what it looks like, and that's why we do what we're doing now, is to attempt to learn within what it is that he pointed towards, hoping that he wasn't the end and that others would pick up the task and follow on, and not just an individual, but a group. So hopefully we will continue in that tradition. But it is great that Torrance is recognized as somebody who does provide what it looks like to be somebody who can have their world of knowledge integrated in the way that TF was able to integrate it. My complaint of much of theological PhDs is that people are studying something that is usually quite irrelevant for most people, but it shows that they've moved the field in a very specific thing. Alan Torrance, when I was doing it, said, you want it to be something like the study of the use of the buggy whip between 1884 and 1896, something that is so specific that nobody else could have done it, but it also, you can see, quite quickly becomes irrelevant. And so it's easy for the theological training of doctors to not actually train people who are going to be serving the church that much. They're just trying to get a job, and they need this proof of being able to do something very specific to be able to get a position. My father-in-law started the second family medicine program for the University of Washington in the United States. He started it in Spokane. He said, in Seattle, the University of Washington trains specialists, but I train people for small towns, and they need to be generalists. They need to be able to assess a broad number of symptomatic things to get them help as quickly as possible. And if they need a specialist, to know who to send them to. And when he said that, I thought, wow, the world needs more doctors who are generalists in theology, who can span the spectrum of what is needed. And we need specialists who are able to deal with fine points. And in some ways, TF was both a generalist and a specialist. He went beyond many in specialities that some specialists didn't go, but he also had a broad general knowledge of the world of theology and science that I think gives what I'm saying here is people who can really see the whole landscape and help people to work within it.
Actually,
So,
Marty,
yeah,
that's something that John McKenna and Jim Houston, they talk about that. You know,
Yep.
they did never, because as soon as you become a specialized person, you're not a person. Because you reduce yourself to tangible things or whatever like that, and the mystery, you know, far more than you could ever say. And John McKenna used to tell me all the time, like, you don't want to ever be a specialist. You know, you got to have general knowledge on and do as much research, because you're looking at the holistic way of approaching things, and that's where the most fruitful work gets done now, is that because of the specialization, you need 2 or 3 PhDs just to understand the language of all these different areas, so that you can actually cross-pollinate anything to actually think something together and show how these things are interrelated. But no one has the time to do that type of stuff, and that's part of the problem with our theological process.
It is.
We've got the fundamental assumptions here about no one has access to the Father except through the Son, and whom the Son chooses to reveal. If you don't start there with the mediation of Christ as the man who's both God and man, the one man mediating between God and man, you're way off on a tangent, and no one gets the fundamentals. Because of these ways you want to be avant-garde and have something unique to offer, we're not standing on the foundation anymore, and that's the problem.
Because of the sheer.
The issue of reforming the academy, though, is tricky. His specialization gets you the job.
Oh,
And that is the problem, is it's become so dependent upon.
Do you remember how Jim used to talk about, like, when he was talking about his stories about Oxford and his time with, like, only the nobodies get a PhD. You know, because like, we missed this, what happened in culture when education became, before it was specialized in sort of a genteel class, part of your realm in that upper lower type thing, but then the mob was able to end up getting education, and that's sort of how you had to sort of combat, it's not your genetics and who, you know, and because even just the way that group of people were taught with that whole readership thing and the discipleship way that you're mentored by your teacher, you know, is a totally different way of conveying knowledge, where they because it is that upper echelon, it's worth the energy to privatize the experience where you're interacting with them, and you go away to go with your teacher to help you work, and they direct and guide you. They don't tell you what to think necessarily, and you're a colleague, where this other way of doing things is a mass production type of thing.
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm going to keep moving on here so we don't get too specialized in isolation.
That according to Fiddes, that militates against the gaining of wisdom.
Right. Which, yeah, wisdom traditions, that whole sense of what is wisdom today in a world that is bombarded with information, what does it mean to learn wisdom? And I think that's a really important point, that there is a sense of an integration of a whole of understanding of things that is required for wisdom to really to be at work. So Torrance is an example of somebody who lives with a wisdom tradition, I think. Thank you for that. So revelation and light on science, the whole idea of this book, he says, is the idea of restoring the queen of the sciences. That, I mean, that's his vision, is that, and I think he puts the onus really on theologians to be the initiators in restoring the place of theology, to restore its sense, the queen of the sciences, though it's quite a tall hill to climb. And maybe we need to sit at tables more than looking for who's the queen and who's the king. In chess games, somebody gets knocked off, and you need the king and the queen. If you lose either one of those, you're done. So chapter 2, the parameters of science. So the question of how we frame what it is that we're doing when we engage science. This is something that there's a long history to. So the frame of reference, how we look, of course, his book, The Christian Frame of Mind, would be a T.F. Torrance proposal on what that would look like. That book does build on this sense of the original framework of Judeo-Christian thought. And again, to say that the nature of Greco-Roman thought is that they tended to abstract in the world. By definition, they begin with human engagement in the world of thinking through human observation, whether it's Plato or Aristotle. Both of them thought from the world, and then thought for Plato to the world of forms or ideals. For Aristotle, the classification of the world into categories. I mean, all of those things were thinking from the given humanness that undergirds something of what we would call modern thought. People think the United States is primarily founded on Judeo-Christian thought, but John McMurray said, "But we are Greco-Roman at heart."
Yes.
Right. And Rome wanted to control the world, so it learned to build highways and mail systems and structures of government and military might. It learned the technology of the world, which is a kind of science that has informed much of what we study even today in terms of how in Western culture we manage the world. So the original framework of Judeo-Christian thought, the critical piece in that structure is that there is a God who creates and brings order. I mean, it's T.F. Torrance's divine and contingent order. That the Judeo-Christian world, there is a creation and it has a creator, and that creator gives it meaning and purpose. And the nature of the people who live in that world is to live in wisdom by gaining wisdom from that God, and that by doing that, one lives a life in the world that's appropriate to the world because it's appropriate to the God who made it. I don't know when the last time is that a whole culture really got that, but I don't know if we've seen it in the modern era. But to say that there is something about what he would call the original framework of science, that it would go back to a God who creates. Once you have creation, then you do have ordering and how one lives in the light of that. So to say, if science is to understand the orderliness of reality and how we live through our knowledge of that reality, how we respond to it, then theology itself, in its original forms, was science. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Okay.
that goes back to the priest of creation, that whole aspect, and even like giving voice to the creation, like we were talking about the amoeba and the fungi.
Yeah, the fungi. Indeed. So Pascal got quoted a number of times here too, didn't he, Bill? He was a voice in this book that isn't quoted as much as he is, but Pascal in the orders of significant relationships, that the lower are made significant by the higher. That kind of ties into TF's understanding of the strata of knowledge that's there. And so this whole idea that contemporary science begins with the lower and attempts to make sense of things that are higher from it, but that in fact the nature of the higher, in Torrance's sense, theological science makes meaningful the context for doing doxology and the lower kinds of levels of what it means to be Christians. So the whole question of what is reason, and for T.F. Torrance, kata phusin, that reason is developed by nature of that which you're studying, that you let that which you are studying teach you in a sense, and reason is formed or shaped from that, which he credits John McMurray for, in a sense, giving him the definition of the word reason and what reasonable thought is in several places. The whole sense of instinct within it, that instinct is an awareness of the other that is open to that which is other, to be taught by that which is other, which, Ted, goes to your whole sense of the humility of what it means to be a science too, that one doesn't come in dominating in the knowing process. One comes in as a learner, a listener, and finds language that one then asks, do you see this? I mean, we become a community to clarify all that. Did you have something there, Ted?
Yeah, I was just going to say that was certainly one of the great attributes of Einstein, who thought some of his greatest ideas came out of visualizations of reality. In other words, he was go beyond this certitude and see that there's something I don't understand here and begin to think about it in new ways.
Yeah.
And that, I think especially in cosmology and some of the sort of leading edge of science, there's more of that is beginning to happen, is because out of humility is saying there's something here we do not understand, rather than coming at it with this certitude. And I think the point I was making before is that I think theologians have to come at reality in the same kind of position of openness.
Absolutely. My wife said that the day she graduated from dental school, they said, now you are a safe learner. You're not going to hurt anybody, but go out and you will learn with every case new things that you didn't have before. And I say this when my students, my D-Min students graduate, I say the same thing. You're a safe learner now. You're not at your end. You're ready to go out and hopefully not hurt anyone. And she said, in dentistry, every case you had to use your intuition to take basic principles, but every mouth was not the same. And you had to intuit what was necessary to help that particular person with their particular issues. So it's easy to think, well, a dentist is pretty easy. You just got a mouth, two sets of teeth with a bunch of teeth. And I mean, how complicated can it get? The answer is very complicated.
Yes.
And so intuition is what is required to be able to treat appropriately each person in a way that's true to the nature of who they are. That's a kata phusin kind of thing. And that requires the intuitive instinct kind of that I think Torrance talks about, and that Fiddes is talking about here as well.
Yes.
Real wisdom requires the humility to say, I won't assume that the hammer will fix everything, but that I need to say, what is it that we need to do for this particular situation to make it work? And we could go on for some time talking about, is theological education doing that for people? Probably TED School is doing that, but I think a lot of schools have a set of classes that professors never talk to one another. I've had that experience more than not.
Right.
And so you don't get an integrated learning. It's a very broken apart form of learning. And so it's hard to intuit all of those bits of learning together. And people have said, the books that stay on the shelf, most of those theology books, I never could quite figure out what I was supposed to do with them in preaching. And I thought, what a tragedy. Though I did have one student who said, you're the first professor that ever brought theology down to where I could actually see it made a difference for a ministry. Wow. And not just the content of an adult class to get them to be able to repeat back creedal statements, but rather to inform the very life of what ministry is all about. So there's a task within theological education to be engaged there as well, I think.
Hey, Marty, this is sort of breaking in here, but
no, go for it.
We're talking about Oxford a moment ago. Is Victor Fiddes and Paul Fiddes related Do you know?
That is a good question. I do not know the answer to that question.
It's quite an unusual name. I thought, wonder if they're like cousins or something. I don't.
I have heard Paul Fiddes. He was in a panel with Paul Molnar, and Paul Molnar was very put out with Paul Fiddes. He just said, he's
Yeah, I can imagine.
Torrance would never say the things that he says, but I mean, he's somebody who kind of uses the term of relational theology, but comes from what you would call the human experience to get to that, rather than from a theological orientation. And Paul was just fit to be tied when that conversation was done.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't know. Bill
Indifferent.
Ford, the ultimate researcher, may be able to find the family relationship there if there is one. So he was Fiddes to be tied.
There you go.
There you go. Yep. So modern science thinks it is independent of natural orders, and science gives meaning to everything. So there is an arrogance that developed in modern science, and one does see this, that we have the answer, we've done the study, you theologians, you're just naive, and you're not really in touch with reality, in a sense, maybe the way that they would say that. And you're maybe helpful for people's private lives as they wrestle through, death and birth and families, but you're not really talking about the big stuff, reality. I mean, there is a sense that is a kind of the independence of science from those everyday private things. When science becomes an autonomous enterprise, then it becomes an act of power. And again, just to our earlier thing, science has become so politicized. So, I mean, I think vaccines became something where people saw science was either working for one side or the other, and science became a political issue rather than a pursuit of what it means to help people and all that. And so it's part of the tragedy of, I think, the climate that we're in, and maybe some of that loss of respect, is that we've lost the ability to know, who do we listen to? Who, even among scientists, quote unquote, tells us the truth? And what is the truth? Right? I mean, all those really are up for grabs right now. So it is a tricky time, and an important one for really theological engagement, I think. So the question of valuing things that work for humanity, if what science studies is what works for humanity, then the human agenda will drive the agenda of science. Right? And just think technology, using the resources of the world to serve humanity in building what it needs for humanity to be better, which I remember J.B. Torrance coming to Washington State and driving up into the mountains, and there was a sign going into one area that said, it was some national forest, land of many resources, or land of many uses. And he said, can they hear what they're saying there? That these forests are just to be thought of in terms of how we can use them. Right? He says it was such a human-centered image of what these natural resources were. It's all about us. National parks, you can't cut trees or anything like that, but these were all, in a sense, they're set aside, but ultimately for our resources, human resources. So the nature of what one values in science depends on what you're going to value it for. And the scientist, generally speaking, he's arguing, I think, values it for human use. And so it defaults to something that becomes not in consideration of stewards of creation or something like that. You've got something there, Bill. I can see you've got a look on your face there.
I was just Fiddes, and Victor adds a lot of color to this text. I mean, he says things like, this is in chapter 2, the energy of love, for example, is certainly as quote unquote real as energy, and energy as the energy of light. But the description of love does not mesh with the mathematics which science employs, and science has had to ignore its reality.
Yeah.
And it is man's never-ending search for lack of meaning that he quotes BC from the comic strip. I mean, this, I'll just add this and then I'll shut up.
No, don't shut up. You keep
But-
going. You're doing great.
It's just this. He says, let's pause to consider the point that this limitation of natural science would not be of such consequence were it not for the fact that modern man is now almost entirely dependent upon his instruments for its conceptual understanding. Modern man is trained to think scientifically. A sobering illustration of this fact is the remark which President Richard Nixon made in July '69 with reference to Neil Armstrong's spectacular landing on the moon. He said, quote, "This is the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation," unquote. After due allowance for political hype, the fact that a president could say such a thing without causing evident embarrassment to the intellectual community, parentheses, Billy Graham did register a mild protest, close parentheses, forces one to ask what criterion of values places the ability of an astronaut to step out of a tin can and walk on the moon ahead of the achievement of a Bach fugue or a soliloquy of Shakespeare's Hamlet, or I might add,
The incarnation of Jesus.
Yeah, one might add that. Yeah.
We just might add that, Billy Graham. Anyway,
Yeah,
maybe he did in his mild protest,
yeah.
but he
Well,
was.
it's raising a really important issue here, isn't it? And that is just the question, can science really acknowledge so much of what we would say is the real world in which we live and function and need to function and are dysfunctioning because we're not able to pay attention to it? Right? Which I mean, I call this the science of the personal, building on what T.F. Torrance has laid out is the nature of understanding a personal God who creates us as persons in his image to live in ways that are appropriate to that relation. That is the science of the personal. And so when you take out the personal and make it all impersonal, you end up with something that's fractured and broken apart, and each person will do what's right in their own eyes and serve themselves, which is the world abandoned to sin, basically. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, no, the color he brings in is very important, and they're they're important points that we could expand a lot more on them.
Yeah.
Because they are important, and it is a basic question of values. You make
Well-
choices to do what you value, and so if you value landing on the moon because it makes you famous, then it says something about not valuing other things that you've missed out, like the music and the arts and the living God.
But the most important week since the creation, the history of the world. Wow.
But if you really get under his statement, wasn't it just saying, "Aren't I great? And aren't I great that I had these people do this?" I mean, I think it was all just a kind of a narcissistic statement.
Oh, well, yeah, I'm president at the time of its happening, I guess. It might be political. Yeah. Well, we're on chapter 2 and it's 5:15, so I won't add any more color.
But no, you're gonna say something on page 19. So because we're almost.
That was it. That was it.
Oh, that was it.
Oh,
Okay. Okay.
That was worth the wait. That was funny.
That's good.
A good
So
one.
this whole sense of of what we talk about with science, then Hegel, the whole idea of reducing justice and morality to science, the desire for technology, to end up with method over meaning. And I mean, in so many ways, that's what the scientific world has done. And maybe Nixon's statement was saying, our technology has given us the meaning. We have conquered even the moon. I mean, so there's the question of what is meaningful within that statement is a very interesting question. So the question, can moral and spiritual qualities be valued by the modern world? I mean, that's really an underlying question of the whole book, and is a question for the church today. What will it look like to reestablish the value of theology, of morality, of what it means to be spiritual people who are connected with the God who made us? Science itself is unable to relate to metaphysical, and again, by metaphysical, it's those things that go beyond the merely physical. That was in Aristotle's book, Beyond the Physical. But to say what goes on in our heads, what's going on in Bill's head as he looks at the screen there, we can't quite get into his head except thinking he's got something interesting that he's thinking about in there. So that's metaphysical, right? We see the physical, but there's beyond the physical. And so to say the thought world, I mean, I'm always working with people saying, you know, what does metaphysical mean? It seems like nobody wants to tie it down. So to say, well, the physical is that face, and the metaphysical is the thought world that goes beyond it. And we want to see that they're related. In a Torrancean way, we would say we can't separate the face from the thoughts that are going behind it. They are irreducibly bound together, but we can attend to one or the other part, but we can't dualistically split them apart. And so science that only is willing to look at the physical body and the disorders in psychology are all the individual with things that are measurable and repeatable of an individual, will miss out, in a sense, the thought world and the relational world, the nature of what happens between persons. Those are not in the DSM, any of the DSMs. DSM-5, which is what insurance bases its work on, it doesn't acknowledge the metaphysical world of being in relationships. You can't get insurance to pay for anything if it's about what happens between people. Only the disorders in behavior and what is recognized as a schizophrenic personality to think people who are broken, which is an objectifying of the human. So that's science not able to deal with what we might call the relational, the theological meaning of what it means to be persons, beings in relation. Science has excluded that even from the possibility of being something that could be looked at, which goes back to your comment of love a moment ago, of the point that he was making about the inability to talk about love. But arguably, you could say there's nothing more important in the world than love. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. I could sing that song, but we get the point. So, the nature of people like Polkinghorne is to re-establish, again, this is a very Torrancean kind of thing, that discovery is the name of the game. Discovery is the name of the game. We're not trying to classify the world, control the world, categorize the world. We're trying to discover the nature of reality so that we can live in light of it. And if we miss the moral and spiritual dimensions of life, we've lost the meaningfulness that God would bring. And there is a kind of a utilitarian meaning, but it's just, how can I use this to make my life or our life better? But the better is a human agenda. He or she who has the most toys at the end wins. He who lives the oldest wins. I mean, all these things, the word wins, of course, is the question of what can technology do to give me a better life? And better life usually has something to do with acquiring, having a certain reputation or something that can be bought. So who has the money is based on what money can buy. So natural science is limited, explores the physical but not the meaning of things. So that is the missing dimension. When you split science from the gospel, you miss the meaning of things. You miss the inner world of humanity and the human, which Fiddes calls that gaining the world and losing the soul, which I thought was a fairly brilliant statement. It's another one of his succinct kinds of things. The idea of the question of pursuing the tree of life or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life was in the garden, and it would have been that which symbolized, living in the presence of God forever. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in a sense, was a test for Adam and Eve as to whether they would live in obedience. They weren't supposed to eat of it. But Karl Barth says it wasn't so that they would fail. It was really an affirmation of love in itself, too. For them to demonstrate the love that was there, they had the possibility of not obeying, but it wasn't God's intention that they not obey. But the nature of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil is that before eating of it, God was the one who gave meaning and direction and provision for life. In having their eyes opened, suddenly they could distinguish between what was good and what was evil. And that is the beginning of a kind of humanistic science where we become the judges, and what is good for me, And what is evil is that which is bad for me. And so that which damages me, embarrasses me, oh no, I'm naked. Oh no, blame, you did it. I judge you. You caused this to happen. All of these judgments came in the independence move from God. And so the tree of the knowledge of good and evil gave a kind of science that distinguishes things in the world, that the human took that role of being the judges. One could say science, in the form that it takes in its humanistic form, was born in that instance. Now, one could say from that, science is the outcome of sin insofar as you do it independent of God. Right? It's not a sin in and of itself. And the Jesus who dies on the cross, he takes away, in a sense, our need to be judges of ourselves or others. And we die into him and we rise again with him again as Lord, as the one who is the judge of good and evil. We are now scientists who live within the wisdom and the life, the engagement of world that he brings to us. The cross is the restoration of science, of good science, the contextualization of our judgment of what is good and true and beautiful within the death, life, and resurrection of Jesus. Dwayne, I see that hand. And then Paul, I'll come to you after Dwayne.
Actually, you notice a difference in the creation story, where when Adam is naming the creatures, in the back of that whole story is an ontological loneliness where he's driven to find his counterpart. He's naming those type of creatures in his science, and he recognizes relational connection with everything. But after he sins, everything becomes utility. That woman, that snake, that rock, that whatever, because and until you rediscover the fact that you have a loving God and a Father over in relationship to you to determine the meaning, like we talked about the knowledge of the tree of life, and even just the nature of the metaphor of tree all throughout the Bible, that trees live a long time and they grow in stature, but they can also die, and it all depends on how they're rooted, watered, and cared for. And anything that which righteousness, trees of righteousness, like God has to be central to sustain life. And when you're detached and don't recognize you're a creature, you lose the meaning of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul.
I was going to also remark on the garden and the activities in the garden before they're being cast out, as a kind of metaphor of this relationship between science and theology. Adam is given these tasks of basically cataloging the garden, naming. It's a scientific mission that he's called to, but in the evening he gets to speak to the Lord about it.
Yes.
There is a consultation going on. Well, what about this? And what about that? And which way should I go? This place is so big. This relationship between inquiry, knowledge accumulation, and then consulting with the Lord, negotiating or seminaring with him in the evening.
Yeah.
And then they hide themselves after they commit the sin.
Yes.
One might ask, why doesn't Adam go and say to the Lord, there was this serpent there and he said this. What about that? What's going on there? But anyway, I find that to be a metaphor. Relationship between Adam and the Lord in the evening, as to what we're trying to say with regard to science and theology.
So the evening conversations were, in a sense, doing theology with God, talking about what he's made and the delight of it all and what it means to live within that. So no, I think that's a beautiful image, and I think it's a true image. And to say in Jesus, that conversation is being invited to happen again, right? And that's that's in a sense what's being pointed to here, that the conversation is still available.
Well, you think of the hymn In the Garden. We sing about that.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think that there is a lot to be unpacked as to what what a healthy vision of the interrelation of the God who creates and sustains, and the invitation of our participation and conversation within that, it is entirely open. Good. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
So, science fails to relate to the realities of life. It's become a closed system that only focuses on material reality. It makes the world an it. Even human beings at some level are its. Study it as an object because that's what science does, is study objective reality. So what motivates science? What motivates science is what works for the human. And the whole understanding of the material world is what they feel like is the workable thing with that within the agendas that are provided for by human needs. And so human need, in a sense, drives that whole thing. But Fiddes, and of course Torrance as well, say the Bible assumes no dualism. The world, the interior world, the world of being persons, is in no way separate, cannot be separated from the world that is created by God. God as the creator, God as participant in the world of the person of Christ, God the Holy Spirit, who works to renew and redeem and restore humans in their full bodily and personal dimensions. So, ancient science had a place for God, i.e., I'd say the nature of the creation story would say there is a God who creates, orders, and calls humanity to live in the world as responsible servants and those who live as caregivers in a world that God entrusts to their caring for it. So the belief, go ahead.
Did you know that the figure of Albert Einstein was carved in stone above Riverside Church in New York?
Only by reading it in here.
Yeah, that is mind-boggling to me. It's in the context of what you were just talking about, the investment of moral worth in science. Explains why it seems entirely appropriate that figure should be carved above the Riverside Church in New York, whereas it would be unthinkable to have it placed above the memorial to the dead at Hiroshima. Einstein, Hiroshima.
Yeah.
It would be unthinkable, but it should be realized that this investment of moral worth and meaning in science is made possible only by removing the logic from logical positivism. Only by removing the logic
from logical positivism.
Yeah, I think we ought to revisit this if we can't make it through today.
Well, make it through has a variety of different meanings, but
Then
you're saying that it's so good that you don't want to rush through the last part. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it is, and I really don't want to. We ought to do it the second half on another date and take our time through this.
We'll see how far we get today. I'm open to that proposal. So, in that you made it, then it isn't me, me trying to foist on other people. So,
yeah, it's me.
It's good stuff. I mean, like I said, it's the most readable of the 7 so far that I've seen. So we'll look at that. I'll try not to rush then. I'll just we'll keep working through here. The belief in an external world independent of the perceiving subject is a basis of all natural sciences. That was Einstein. So the belief in an external world independent of the perceiving subject is the basis of all natural sciences. So for Polanyi then to talk about indwelling the world, what it means to indwell the world is to recognize that our participation in the world gives us a knowing as persons in the world that is other than ourselves. So it's not just collapsed into us. And yet there is this sense that all of our knowledge, as Polanyi said, is personal knowledge. We know this world that is not ourselves, and we indwell it and we come to know it. And it is in that knowing relationship that a proper form of science comes. But the world is what teaches us. It isn't a Kantian transcendental unity of apperception where we frame out of our thoughts, we put everything into boxes that our head says, I should put it in this box or that box. Now we are trying to shape reality out of our thinking instead of letting that which is truly there in the world shape our thinking. So it's no small feat, it's no small piece, and I think Einstein, Polanyi, and Torrance would all want to acknowledge the need for that move in how we think about the nature of what it is that science is doing. So what is the nature of the ultimate reality to which humans are called to relate? And again, if you ask the person on the street that, what is the ultimate reality to which we as humans have to relate? Most people would just say, what? What do you mean ultimate reality? Well, I guess it's the world. I mean, some people might say their family or something, but the point one there, objective science has no concern for humans as persons, to say our ultimate concern is to live in relationship with other persons. And with that, that could be just the humans. We obviously want to say with Fiddes that God is the ultimate personal being who is the ultimate concern for humans. But even to not be able to really recognize other humans as the ultimate concern for humanity can only happen in a world of individualism where everyone looks out for themselves and does what is right in their own eyes. Thank you, last verse in the book of Judges. Social sciences have a concern about the realm of the personal, but they still look at it impersonally and objectively. So I have people ask me this question all the time when I say, I'm a relational theologian and I do a science of the personal through theology, because science does not treat people, humans, as persons. And they say, what do you mean? Psychology does that. Sociology does it. And it's like, you may think that, but both sociology and psychology assume the objectivity of a person without seeing the personal dimensions. Though there are some hospitals that say, we do people care here, not just healthcare. And they're saying we won't just look at you as a body to be worked on, but they're trying to overcome what is the norm of medicine, and that is to see you as a body. And they say, we see that person in there. Because most people think of what medicine wants to do is just fix the bodily aspect of their being. And psychology it can only deal with, and was really built out of dealing with the things that go wrong in the human mental function, right? It's all based out of, and the word is escaping my mind. What's the word for when you just look at things that go wrong? Anyway, that's the word. That's the definition. Oh, it'll come to me tonight in the middle of the night. I'll go, there it is. So psychology began by looking through the model of machines like watches and other things like that, and saying, humans are like these. And if we just fix what's broken, what's gone wrong here, if we go with that model, then we can fix the thing that's gone wrong. It then moved in the 19th century with Darwin and Freud into having animals be the primary modality in which to assess what is wrong. What goes wrong with animals, and then how do we transfer those images over to the human? So to say that the nature of the discipline of psychology, it's built on impersonal, non-human models to look at, no, it's not malignant. Malignant, that's a good word, but it's not the one I'm looking for. The nature of what it is that develops then in psychology. There is positive psychology now that's beginning to kind of say, what would it look like to be healthy? But the history of psychology is all based on the question, what are the things that are wrong with humans, and how do we look at them without even getting at necessarily what healthy looks like? And it doesn't take long looking at Freud to recognize that, his definition of what might be implied as health is probably not very healthy. So anyway, the nature of the social sciences then, the model of somebody watching or looking at a village of Africans to study their social networks, the observer who doesn't enter in and change the nature of what's going on, only observes from the outside, classically will not really understand the nature of the people. To understand a tribe in Africa, you'd have to be one of them. And to say that there came a point at the University of Otago where I did my PhD where they changed the name of the religious studies department to phenomenology of religions, which was not even necessarily good, because they recognized that religious studies took Christian categories and then read other religions through those categories, and it wasn't really true to the nature of even Judaism or Islam, much less Buddhism, Hinduism, or other kind of world religions. And so when you do sociology and have a category of what it means to be social, and then read a group of people through that, you're likely not to really hear what's going on for those people. You won't understand the history, the story, the nature of the behaviors of what's there. And I mean, this is one of the things I'm looking forward to, going to Japan and hearing Japanese talk about what it means to be Japanese. Because people, well, I was talking to somebody yesterday who said when they went to Japan in the 70s, everything they read about Japan was about what was wrong in Japan, because people were disinclined because Japan was taking over the car market and other things. And so there was a general kind of prejudice against the culture. And one could say that's a sociological read that is just looking for who are we in relation to these people, but can't really see or hear the people because your categories are all self-interested. And sociology has a difficult time getting out of that self-interested orientation in doing its study. And so T.F. Torrance, he begged in several lectures that I've listened to, as well as in the letter he wrote for John McMurray, saying the social sciences have not yet caught up with the physical sciences and being able to step back and see the whole and to see it from God's perspective. There are Christians who have done that, but we have yet to see it in the world of the social sciences. They're still, as humans, so interested from the human perspective and blind to what that's doing in how they observe and come with their conclusions, that in a sense, they aren't even scientists. And you get some of that concern in Fiddes' book here as well, that the social sciences are missing a place to really understand without a quite profound reading from a human perspective with its own self-interest. So the media of God in Christ is the message that he wants to say theology brings to reconcile the world to an ultimate reality. So God is the ultimate reality. The message that we have in our theological science is that the God who created the world is reconciling the world, restoring humanity and the world. And to have our science align us within that is to be involved in the work that God has been doing since the creation of the world, or at least since the fall, to restore that which he has made. Chapter 3, then, was there anything else that you had there, Bill? Those are the two chapters everybody had to read. So, I mean, you had a chance at least to read through those things, and we've highlighted and commented on those things. So, do you have something there, Bill? No, nothing else there. Okay. So the mystery of matter. What's the matter with the mystery of matter? So the mystery of matter is, if you see the universe as a machine, everything is irreducibly object. And the nature of what it is that Newton does then, which Torrance unpacks in many ways, is you just see the world as having a bunch of parts, and we're going to study everything in parts. And the nature of matter is just to see atoms and quarks and black holes and stars and universes all as just part of an impersonal machine. Dwayne, I see that hand.
Yeah, it just dawned on me what you're saying there, that this whole impersonal problem that we have is because of the influence of the satanic or the problem of evil, because that is the source of all evil, because it has no capacity to love. It's the center of the universe, and it becomes a black hole and sucks everything. It has no sympathy. It has no compassion. It has no capacity to understand how we are so much better interrelated and doing much more through fellowship and koinonia and co-inhering than trying to be individualistic and look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me, and everyone's got to bow down to you. Like it's totally, but that's the influence of the common man with the deception that they have. That's why we can, we speculate about what the possibilities are, but unless we're like Jesus, yet without sin and able to withstand the testing, we get sucked in every time.
Yeah. And it may be look at me, or it may be don't look at me, leave me alone. In C.S. Lewis's Hell, in The Great Divorce, everybody keeps moving further and further away from one another. And hell is literally a place where you go out to the far reaches of the universe and you can see people who are out there alone in houses where the rain comes right through the roof because it has no reality to it. It's just such a brilliant analogy of the other side of a hellish kind of thing. And I think there are many people today who, just leave me alone.
That's
Is kind of that's their form of individualism, and
yeah.
They become disconnected, and there is a kind of a loss of humanity in a sense that's there, which another C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. Of course, in Lewis's Narnia, animals speak. They have the capacity for personhood. So in Prince Caspian, the children have gone into Narnia and they're going with Trumpkin through the woods and they see a bear. Now, this bear could be a talking bear or a not talking bear, i.e., personal or merely just an animal. Trumpkin shoots the bear, and the children say, "How do you know it wasn't a talking bear?" And he said, "I could see the look in its eye. It had gone wild inside." And the two girls have this little aside, what if in our world someday humans were like that and they went wild inside? And Lewis is proposing this thing where humans lose contact in a sense. They lose the capacity to be with and for one another. And they kind of go wild inside and become like animals. Now, I don't know if you watch the news these days, but there are questions about the inhumanity of humans to other humans that you begin to say, is this what Lewis was thinking of? I mean, is this kind of a fulfillment of a prediction of an individualistic society that loses touch with humanity and humans start going wild inside? So anyway, there's a few ideas that kind of pop out of what it is you're saying, Dwayne. I think that a totally different way to say the same thing is when I start talking on the nature of the doctrine of sin, I say most of us live the doctrine of sin every day in our lives with the need to be right. If I'm right, I'm the judge and you're wrong. And so, I need to win and you need to lose. And if you lose, I win. And then I have to fight back with it. And I'm afraid of being wrong. And so the nature of me needing to be the judge is problematic. The fact that I'm afraid of losing the argument or being wrong means that I'm living primarily out of fear and defending myself. And it makes it all about judging, largely based on performance and opinion, which has no capacity to love. So I say to my clients all the time, the question, who's right here or what is the right thing to do, is always the wrong question. The question to ask is, what is the loving thing to do here? Because that is the law of, that's the royal law of Christ, is, what does love do here? And love always considers myself and the other. Right? And so when you just say, I need to be right, now it's become individualistic. What is the loving thing to do here? That's considerate. And you use that word, Dwayne. What is considerate for all of us? So to just recognize the nature of the relational that is in the divine ordering of things is what it means to be persons, what it means to be in relation, even relating to the non-human world. What does love do here in caring for environments? How do we care for species that are threatened? How do we care for a world? That is part of the question that love calls us to ask. So good science maintains, I think, a motive of love. So if it's just a machine that we control, tamper with, use it for our own resources, we've neglected the matter of the world. Relativity theory was a move away from Newton. This is something TF says all the time, as a catalyst to change, to think about the interrelatedness of all things. And as Heisenberg said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our methods of questioning. And so there's just an acknowledgement on Heisenberg's part to recognize that our methods of questioning mean that it's going to default to what's about us, and we're going to read into what it is we're observing to ask the question of how it impacts us. And many people will they'll miss the nature of what was right in front of them. The nature of somebody, I watch a number of kind of historical dramas and all that. And so you see houses you have one or two people with a lot of money who own the house and all these servants. And a lot of people they only show up as somebody who walks through and serves, brings the coffee, tea. And you just wonder, if those people were treated as persons, what stories would they have to tell? What value could they bring beyond the job that they are boxed into? Right? And I think it's the question about what is exposed to our methods of questioning. The question of the employer is, can you make a meal for me? Can you clean the house? And if you fit within that, my question is going to determine who you are. And I think, this is still a big problem just in how people get jobs today and all that too, is that the questions that we ask shape our view of a person in a way that may not really be true to who they are as a person. So do they matter to us is another use of the word matter that this chapter is asking, but it does fit in. It's how we observe and how we shape our interpretation of the world and the people that are around us. Now, he does talk about the challenge of quantum mechanics, that the world no longer is being seen to work in all the same ways that it did before, where the nature of the speed of light was the given for Einstein. The question of quantum understandings of things, where something happens here and on the other side of the world in an instant, it may violate what would be our standard ways of interpreting the world, even within Einstein's vision of what it is that was going on. So Fiddes asked the question, where does truth lie? Which again, this is just such a big question today anyway, but positivism is just reading off our observation of the world. So that's the observational view that doesn't ask questions about the meaning. Idealism only asks about the meaning in a sense and doesn't really deal with the nature of the material aspect of it. So in a sense, both of those are problematic in what it is they propose as starting points. One might say one begins with Plato. How does this fit into the perfect ideal form of what this is supposed to be? Take a family, what is the ideal family? And you can spend your whole life trying to be an ideal family. Positivism just looks at how they're behaving and doesn't ask any questions. Why are they behaving this way? It doesn't have the ability to penetrate into the dynamics of what is making this family function well, or what would help it to be a better functioning family. Dwayne, I see that hand. You're on
So
mute.
yeah, sorry. Jim quotes Kierkegaard about that, about the guy selling. He's selling his science as truth for sale, and you go there to buy for truth, but he's not selling you truth. There's no relation to what's written on the sign for sign. He's selling a sign. Kierkegaard is pretty funny about that. And it just that's the nature. Like, we get sold a bill of goods that have no correlation to what our expectation was. That's what advertising does. They try and trick us every time.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting things to pursue on that. A little fawn just walked by my window here. It's kind of fun with spots and everything on it, but a little bit of reality walking by my window there. So the mystery of matter is just the question: how, as science and how as theologians, do we engage the world, and what is actually there? Is it just what we can touch, see, and observe? Or do we say the world really has a dimension of meaningfulness to it that is the matter of the world as well? That's the full orbed sense of the world. If you only choose one part or the other, you make a misstep. And this is TF's constant concern with dualisms, that either choose the world of the observable or the world of the thought, and miss the whole. So that is the agenda that is pursued going forward. So chapter 4, then, the nature of scientific discovery. And in this case, Fiddes says he's focusing on the small, i.e. atoms and so forth. So the scientist, almost by definition, is a specialist. If you're going to be a scientist, you have to choose the discipline within science that you're going to study. So if you're an astronomer, you're not going to do biology. They're different worlds. And if you're going to be a doctor, you're not going to be somebody who works on oil rigs and figuring out how to best get oil out of the places where the oil is buried deep beneath the surface of the earth. So the nature of science is it has a fracturing capacity to it from the very beginning. And so we end up with scientists who have already chosen something that's narrow without being able to ascertain all that's being missed out. And so they focus on experimenting things to create a theory. And the nature of experiment is already a chosen aspect of the world. And then they come up with theories and try and prove it. Hopefully there are people who can say that, that doesn't work, but it ends up with narrow conversations that don't give us a full or picture of the nature, the integrated nature of the world as Einstein, Polanyi, and Torrance would have it. What was once called natural philosophy is what ultimately was called science. So in the early foundations of the world, building universities, they didn't have a philosophy department, they didn't have a science department, they had a natural philosophy department that looked at the nature of the world and thought about it. Philosophy is the study for wisdom, the study for knowledge of things, and they're studying particularly the natural world. But the methods of theorizing without experiment, which were part of that, it was a world where you didn't even have to do experiments, is what he says, developed later in time to need experiments, and then you experiment to test. You test the theory that you have, hoping to prove something. But the question, are you really engaging in reality, or are you trying to foist your ideas onto reality? I mean, that is the potential, what Alan Torrance once called the sleight of hand. Look what I'm doing. See how it's proving this. And it's like, yeah, but you're not showing us all the things that you're not showing us. And maybe you're not even aware of those. So the nature of the sleight of hand is that it focuses our attention and doesn't reveal all the things that we aren't saying.
Well, isn't that pin the tail on the donkey? It's
well,
your
there you're
idea
literally blindfolded.
Yeah, you're blindfolded.
Scientists want to tell you they've taken the blindfold off, but they won't tell you about all the things they put under covers, right? I mean, that would be the problem. So the proposal here is that if we're going to have scientific discovery, and this is going to go all the way through the end of the book to what is the gospel, scientific discovery is a grasp of reality. And so the question of what is reality comes up again here. So people will sometimes say, you're a theologian. I can't believe in imaginary friends. I've literally had people say this to me. And what they're saying is, I can only believe in a physical world that I can see, and I haven't seen God. And I can't see that just looking at the natural world, I can't see that God necessarily must have made that. If you want to believe it, that's fine. But I just think you've made up an imaginary friend you talk to, prayer, who you hope in that he'll provide a future for you. But I have no basis of going in that direction. So it just calls into question, what is reality? And even beyond that, who is reality? And even the question that Bill brought up earlier on love is, if love is a reality, is love truly and merely reducible to materialistic aspects of our bodily function, which is, you get these things every Valentine's Day, right? Love is just the chemicals in your body that are doing this and that. It isn't really a real thing. And so there's a denial of the basic of reality of what it is that love is, what love does in and through the human, much less what it is from God. Fiddes proposes that mathematics in the pursuit of science has a value, and that it does allow us to measure the nature of everything in the world, whether it's years or weights or the atomic weight of particular elements, all these things. Mathematics at some level does help us with those things, but it pursues a kind of certainty where if you don't have certainty, and certainty is not as obvious as one might think of being a human value. It's not just certainty in and of itself, it's certainty to me. Prove it to me. If I can't be certain, then it's not true. So the word certainty in and of itself inclines itself to a human-centered way of thinking about the world and what is true. Leslie Newbegin in his book, Proper Confidence. Confidence, on the other hand, is a way of being sure of another, something that is other. If you're confident in a person or your car, then it's about a relationship that you have with that in which you have confidence. So if you're confident in a branch that's not very strong, your confidence is ill-founded. You don't really have a reason to have a confide, which the word fide is the word faith, of course, proper faith. So if you trust in success through money instead of success in knowing the living God who made you and knows what it looks like for you to be all you might be, if your confidence is in your ideas about you being a success, your confidence is ill-placed. It's self-centered, not grounded in reality. But if our confidence is in the God who knows us and loves us, that he has called us his own, and we live in the light of that, that confidence is transformative to live in the light of what is a true reality. So to say the nature of just looking for certainty sets up a world that humans are trying to be the judges themselves and everything is a human-based thing. It's back to that problem. But there are potentially appropriate uses of mathematics that are giving us confidence. So you can abuse or use anything, right? There is a book called The Myth of Certainty, though, that says we live in a world now that we've made science the measure of certainty. And so we trust it because we think it can give us certainty. And so we don't trust God because we can't be certain that we will get what we want when we pray or whatever. And so people have neither certainty nor confidence. And so they have no trust. And trust is the basis of what faith is about. And so their inability to have their desires or needs met becomes problematic. And in some ways, the nature of how we present the gospel, if my choice is all important, then if my choice is what saves me, I made this decision, therefore Jesus has to save me, then we will forever be fully unsure whether our choice was adequate. Instead of saying, he made a choice for me and I will trust in his choice. And I'll live with an awareness that what he chooses to be and to do for me, that is the foundation. And I'll simply have faith that he is the one who's adequate and it won't depend upon me getting it right, as though somehow I could measure my faith.
Well,
Yep.
This probably doesn't fit quite right, but I've heard Torrance say on the Ground and Grammar tapes, talking about mathematical, in the context of mathematics, that if it's certain, it's not true, and if it's true,
Yes.
it's not certain. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So if it's true, it's not certain, is to say that the nature of reality is that it's dynamic. I mean, this is part of Torrance's open system. If it's true, it's dynamic, and therefore you can't fix it into a box. And if you're making it certain, then that's your human certainty that's affixing its certainty. And you have become the judge, you are the measure. And therefore, it's not true to the nature of the dynamic nature of reality, because the certainty is actually all about you.
Yeah, your nervous system.
Does that make sense, Bill?
I'll ponder that, Marty. I'll have to go back. You were breaking up there a little bit.
If you recognize certainty as a human function,
Yeah.
if certainty is a human function, then if you're certain, then it's not true to the nature of God and who the way God has designed the world, which is dynamic and changing.
I got that.
So, and if it's part of the nature of the world that God has created in a dynamic open system, then it's not certain because God can change it at any point. We can't claim that it's got to stay the same. God has the freedom to do what God wants with his creation and to keep it a living, open, vital reality.
So we approached in a heuristic manner, do we?
Heuristic is not certain. That's right. It is
All right. I mean, well,
building.
you use the
Really
word
building.
discovery in relation,
Yes.
the openness,
Yes.
right?
And
Well,
that is not. It
that's
is not
contingency as
certain.
well.
What's that?
Because that's the problem with contingency. Care like with science and contingency, that I like John McKenna and Carey would talk about that. See, that's the problem with the Greek. They want the static, immovable, unmoved mover. That's not true. You may think it's certain, but it's not true. It's your own perception. But that's the nature of the openness of God's creation, because that's why we can have God become flesh. That's why we can be resurrected from the dead. These are all contradictions that have no correlation in truth. You know, it's your certain truth that when you're dead, you're dead. That's a certainty. No. If a man dies, will he live again? Yes. He may even a new creature in a new world. Like that's the nature of the truth, that it's not contained in the box. Because a lot of times with our encapsulated way that we look at things, with our preconceived conceptions, that's what we build all our world on, that certainty of these preconceived notions. If one of those things aren't true, everything you've done is taking you nowhere. But the reality, the truth is that it's not determined by our nervous system. And this is why the mediation of Christ is the truth. He doesn't say, I'm certain, it's, I am the truth, the way, the life, and the truth. And it's the nature of God's character. And that's where the word faith and faithfulness come in, because that's sort of, that's what Tom and James and David and anyone in this circle with Bart, it's God's faithfulness that holds the covenant. And John McKenna would have said the same thing with the great I am in his covenant faithful and covenant love with his people. Like that's what holds it all together, God's faithfulness. Yeah. The world isn't in by surprise. It's determined by what God wants to do, not what we do. We can build
another way of saying is, if you have God in a box, it's probably not God in the box. It's probably you in the box. Right?
All right.
Okay. I'm just going to quickly finish up, and we'll save chapters 5 through 12 we'll do another session later on that, Bill, since you suggested. But just to end up on chapter 4, Kant again had this whole sense that the human is separate from the world, and that we think about the world and create, in a sense, the nature of the reality of the world from our thoughts, independent of the world, as part of the whole idea of knowledge is in the head, and we interpret the world, but the foundation of knowledge is in the human head. Point F, the harmony between human thought and independent empirical reality. That's what Maxwell and Einstein wanted to do, is to say we need to deal with human thought and reality together. They always have to be thought of together. If they're separated apart, that's the word that Torrance uses dualism for. And we have a tendency to do one or the other. Or as Alan Torrance said, every major university in the world today has two major parts. There's the School of the Natural Sciences, and they won't talk to the humanities. And the humanities say, oh, those people, they're all just into the, the physical stuff. They don't deal with the reality of all of the humanities. And they are dualistically choosing one or the other side of that coin. But Torrance and Bart and this author, I say, we have to hold them together. And that's what Maxwell and Einstein said as well. So for Einstein, there is no scientist without faith. Every scientist has faith in their capacity. They have faith that the world is there, that when the world is there, they discover it. And there are things they can say, I think this is what's going on. And the faith is the ongoing dynamic engagement, coming to understand and live with the world. And the last point there, we cannot eliminate the observer from what is observed. And this is what science, by definition, with which observe we're not personally involved. It's objective science. No personal opinion here, but like a Polanyi statement, there is no knowledge that is not personal knowledge. In every act of observing, recording, reading what somebody else observed, at every step, the personal is involved. So we cannot eliminate the observer from what is observed. Heisenberg principle, of course, goes into that as well. Well, this is good stuff, and I will take Bill's vote for looking at the other parts of this later in the future. But it is invigorating stuff, and I think it has great application for the question of how we have conversations today. And the little things that he does, Bill, that you mentioned that add color, they're helpful
Yeah.
for conversation.
Helps to have the book, but I checked it out of the library,
Yes.
so.
Right. Well,
Well,
I
actually,
might.
what do you think? What do you think about his point? I think for continuing for the next time is that this bridge has to be led by the theologian back to the scientist, not the scientist back to the theologian. I think he's right about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true, but I think we need people who embody both. I think we can't think either or even here. We have to think who are the people who stand in the gap and can help bring together the ways of thinking to recognize they are not necessary to be separate.
Yeah.
The nature of science, I mean, this is my basic, point out. The nature of science is the human observing that which is other than human to understand it and better live in the light of it. And that includes God and the natural world.
And you have an article coming in Participatio regarding this subject? Or
It will be coming. There are 2 articles I will be writing for Carrie, but it's going to be a year or 2 before
Oh.
you see that. So part of my exercise in going through these books is to become familiar with them. I'm looking at spending some time with Carrie in Oklahoma to learn some of the methodology of historiography, to be able to talk about these being written in their time, the value they contributed, how it helps Torrance studies, and where the conversation could go from these books in what was then a frontier, but the frontier's moved. So what are the opportunities that are still available? What things need to be laid aside, things like that. So I
okay.
think it could be a book, but I'm going to try and keep it to an article. But if you've seen in Participatio, my articles aren't always short.
All right.
So anyway, yeah.
Well,
Good.
thank you very much.
You are very welcome. I think next week we have Jerome Van Kijken with his chapter from this book. So that's what we'll be looking at next week. So
Good.
thank you all for being here today. Been great to be with you. Many blessings.
And you. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye.